Time for another edition of the Improbability Engine. I'm Will Aubrey. My buddy Joe Darnell is here with me. And as always, we start with our moment of what?
That's right, Will. Let's start first in minor league baseball, the home of miscreants and misfits that always seems to give us something. And this time it's no different. The Jacksonville Jumbo Shrimp, as part of a promotion night, will be giving out, for Father's Day, pregnancy tests. That's right. They're going to be giving out pregnancy tests to the first some number of fans. And they call it an evening filled with suspense, intrigue, and manila envelopes. When I first heard about this story, I actually stopped what I was doing. It was on the news. It was playing. I stopped what I was doing, and I looked at my wife and said, "What? What did that guy just say?" So it had to be my moment of what?
Okay. Sometimes I struggle to get a moment of what. I guess I should be thankful for that.
Yeah, you could be me, looking around and saying, "What? What the? Come on!"
Other times, it's just all around you.
Absolutely.
So, those are the times when you're like, well, what are you going to do?
Right.
But here's my moment of what.
All right.
Paul Pierce, who was a commentator on the NBA Finals, said that Kevin Durant and Steph Curry were the best 1-2 combination in the history of the NBA. Now, I'm not going to say that they're not outstanding players. I'm not even going to say they shouldn't be in the conversation as to who the top two guys were, that were on the same team. But just to say they're the top two, they're the top duo, period, I think that's a stretch. What about Shaq and Kobe?
Right. During their primes, nonetheless. No, and you can do that down the list. I think what all sports talk, and I think this falls under sports talk, all sports talk falls many times into the recency fallacy. They get into this concept that because it's happening now, it's somehow better than what it was before. And that's not to say that athletes have not gotten more talented or more athletic or more capable, or the game is played this, they're doing things that no one else has done. But it's really difficult to say that.
Right, because there have been a lot of great duos.
Absolutely.
Shaq and Kobe, Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson. Magic Johnson.
You think about that, you just go through and it's just a bit it's a bit funny. And the greatest one that I see nowadays is LeBron. They talk about LeBron like it's never happened before.
Right, but if you compare his numbers to Larry Bird's when they both were 30, Bird had better numbers.
Absolutely. And had less time in the league, was still developing as a player, was behind the curve on where LeBron was. The big argument that you hear is, the league has never seen a 6'8", 6'9" guy with the skills that LeBron has. And the first thing that comes up is Magic Johnson.
Absolutely.
Magic Johnson played 5 positions in the NBA Finals. He started at center and was a point guard at 6'9". The guy was amazing. You could say what you want about the difference in athletes and the difference in players between the 1970s and 80s and today, and you have a great argument. There's a great argument to be made there. But you can't just make a blanket statement and say, well, this has never been done before. Because it has.
And for people who would like to know more about the history of the NBA, watch the 30 for 30 about the Celtics and Lakers.
So good.
It is awesome.
So good. And honestly, for all the talk, the league nowadays has nothing on the rivalry that was there in the league in the 80s. I mean, It was a different animal. It was Boston and it was LA, and that the cities were different, the teams were different, the coaching staffs were different, the fans were different. I mean, it was as unique to each other, and you can't find that anymore nowadays. I mean, you have guys leaving teams and going to other places, and it happened then, but it just kind of waters everything. Everything is homogenous now in the NBA.
Our big topic, greatest coaches in Murray State history, and we're talking about men's basketball.
Yeah, men's basketball here, and I've got a list of 7, and I don't want anybody to think that my list is somehow the list. But I look at these 7 coaches, and I'd love to hear your input on this. These 7 coaches in Racer men's basketball history each did something that was pivotal to building the Racer tradition that we have now.
Who are you going with at number 1?
You go with the guy. You know what? Mine have to be in order. You got to go with Carlisle Cutchin. Carlisle Cutchin was, I think, without Carlisle Cutchin and his results, none of the rest of the coaches even have a shot at Murray State. That's not to say that they wouldn't have gone on and been successful somewhere else. But Carlisle Cutchin, first coach at Murray State in basketball, men's basketball, and not only does he begin the program, which is great. Lots of people have begun programs. That doesn't make them all that good. This is a guy who had All-American level players. He developed the level of success in the 20s and 30s that was pivotal, that during the times after that, when other schools were dropping their programs for basketball, Murray State, being a smaller school in Western Kentucky, didn't. They hung on to basketball because of the success that Carlisle Cutchin had. And I think that's a very, very... He's the cornerstone. He's the godfather. He's the one that you have to look at, and everybody owes Carlisle Cutchin, period.
Okay. Quick story regarding Carlisle Cutchin and one of his best players, Jim Phillips. Phillips led them to the SIAA final in 1936, which was about as close to a national championship as you could get. Anyway, so Jim Phillips played his high school basketball at Tulu, and they didn't have a gym. So,
now, this is Tulu in Crittenden County, correct?
It's on the Ohio River.
Yeah. So, yeah, I actually knew a guy who went and played football at Murray State from Tulu.
Okay. But anyway, so Cutchin goes to recruit him, and he and a bunch of his buddies are swimming in the Ohio River, and Cutchin calls him over, and so he walks out of the river naked as a jaybird to talk to the head coach at Murray State.
You know what, though? That's one of those where you say, Coach, this is just who I am. I don't know what to tell you. This is who I am. No, and
now
that's pretty impressive.
For me,
yeah,
the top 3 have to be the 3 that won NCAA tournament games, which is
I absolutely can appreciate that.
Steve Newton, Billy Kennedy, and Steve Prohm.
Yeah, and I look at all 3 of those guys. They're on my list as well. To be really honest with you, those 3 guys took what Ron Green gave back. So for me, you look at there's like 2 eras of Racer basketball. You've got the early days where you've got Carlisle Cutchin, Harlan Hodge, and Hodges, and Cal Luther.
Right.
Those 3 guys were the instruments of early success for Murray State basketball. And without those guys, you don't have the continued interest in the program. You don't have the guys coming afterwards. But the drop-off after Cal Luther and prior to Ron Green was the lowest point for Murray State basketball. And it was a real threat. I mean, budgets were getting cut. And all of a sudden, in walks the SEC Coach of the Year, Ron Green, who comes in and quite frankly, saves the program. I mean, I'm trying not to delve into hyperbole after our talk about hyperbole like 10 minutes ago, but what Ron Green did, not just in winning games, which he did, not just in putting Murray State back on a national radar, which he did, but what he did to change the perception of Murray State basketball coming from Mississippi State, bringing in players like he did, winning games, and changing the level of expectation for Murray State. I think you can't look at, if you have a list of greatest coaches, Ron Green's got to be on the list. The man saved the program. He turned it around. He brought it back. He was the Renaissance man. He was the rebirth of Murray State basketball into this modern era. And since that time, you've got some guys like Steve Newton, Billy Kennedy, and Steve Prohm that have built upon that and taken it to levels that I'm not sure that even Ron Green would have thought of at that point.
Let's talk about the three that you just mentioned. Harlan Hodges,
Yep.
He definitely had a great deal of success,
Yep.
and he did not get Murray State to the NCAA tournament,
Right.
But he did have a great deal of success, and I think got them to the NIT in the 50s,
Yeah,
as I recall.
and got them in the Associated Press
Top 25.
top 25, which to me is an
It
important
was actually
step.
top 20, I think.
Yeah, I think it was 16 was what they peaked out at. But that's the whole point. I mean, you look at what he did, and you can say, well, he never had the level of success that, even Carlisle Cutchin had.
Right.
But in his era, he brought that name forward and did so in such a way that kept Murray State building and growing. One of the things that happened during those early days were the North-South Cage Classics, the games that brought high school All-Americans in to play at Racer Arena. And there were some really great players that came through there. And that helped to cement Murray State's place in the national basketball lexicon. I mean, that was a big deal.
Then you get Cal Luther.
Absolutely.
And he definitely did an outstanding job. Took Murray State, I believe, to 2 NCAA tournaments
Yep.
in the 1960s.
Yep.
And
The first ones.
the first ones in school history.
Right. And he's the guy. Again, it's all about what is the level of success we expect from Murray State. Carlisle Cutchin was, we expect to win. Harlan Hodges was, we expect to be nationally relevant amongst larger universities. We at least be mentioned. Cal Luther said, we expect to perform at a national level. And that's a big step. I mean, to even do that, to build the program in such a way as to make that possible.
Now, Ron Green, as you mentioned, had been Coach of the Year in the SEC
Yep.
at Mississippi State. He had beaten Kentucky
Yep.
when he was at Mississippi State. He comes to Murray State in his first year. He goes 4-22
Yep.
because he turns over the entire roster.
Absolutely.
But 2 of the 4 games he won were against Western Kentucky. So
to some people, that's enough. You're like, oh, okay, you're showing signs. That's
but,
okay.
They hung him in effigy that first year. They really seriously did. I was a student at Murray
Oh, my
State
God.
at the time. They hung him in effigy. He brought in the 4 to score, which at first the fans hated.
Yeah.
And
It's slow.
it is.
It is a slow system. It's
But-
a spread, slow system.
But after a while, after he had some success, when he went to the 4 to score, people would stand up and applaud and cheer.
Absolutely.
So, and then, into the 1980s, he had a good deal of success at Murray State. Won some big games, beat Notre Dame.
Yep.
That was a big victory. Tied for some Ohio Valley Conference championships.
got unlucky in some of those, I think. I mean,
And-
ended up in the NIT more than what I personally think he deserved. I mean, looking
Right.
back on it. But
But, the OVC has only ever gotten more than one team in the tournament once. So
Right.
Murray State wasn't going to get in as,
well,
as
here's,
an at
here's
large.
the interesting. When we talk about the OVC getting multiple bids, the only time that's really happened was in the time immediately following Ron Green at Murray State. Now, those weren't Murray State teams, but they were teams that
Ron may have actually been coaching at Murray State the year that happened.
He might have been.
It was 83 or 84.
Right, and so you've got some of those teams like Middle Tennessee and Austin Peay, and they win games in the tournament, and they do things like that.
Do you know why the OVC got 2 teams in that year?
Murray State beat them in the finals, right?
No.
No?
No.
Tell me then. Tell me.
The commissioner of the OVC was the head of selection committee.
About time for that then.
He wound up being commissioner of the Big Ten later.
Well, that makes sense then. If only Steve Newton's boys would have knocked off Michigan State that 16-1.
But after Coach Green comes one of my 3, Steve Newton, and Steve he went to the NCAA tournament and won a game in the NCAA tournament in 1988, and it was the first game Murray State ever won in the tournament, and for a long time, it seemed like it would be the only game Murray State ever won in the tournament.
Yeah, and you look at that, and it would be easy to make light of that game, except that this wasn't against, a team that didn't have a pedigree or a coach or. This was North Carolina State. They had won the national championship in '83. They had Coach Valvano since that time has become an icon for his fight against cancer. But before that, before Jim Valvano, cancer survivor or cancer fighter, or he was Jim Valvano, top coach in the country. He was one of those guys that was mentioned. You said, oh yeah, he's a good coach. He can coach. He can recruit. And you have guys that are really talented that are still involved in basketball that were from his coaching tree. I mean, you look at a guy, Vinny Del Negro is a guy that comes to mind. He was on that team, I believe, in '88. And he's been in coaching in the NBA for years, played in the NBA forever. But you look at those guys, that's the impact. They beat a really good NC State team.
Yes, and that victory over North Carolina State propelled them into the second round where they almost beat Kansas, the team that went on to win the NCAA tournament that year.
Absolutely.
And they were right there with them.
Absolutely. That was the year Danny Manning and Danny and the Miracles, they kind of came out of nowhere. Won games that they probably shouldn't, and in all honesty, the closest game they played was against Murray State.
And then you go to the 1991 or 92 season where Murray State plays Michigan State in the NCAA tournament and almost pulls off an upset. Would have been the only 16-1 upset in the history of the tournament.
Took them to overtime.
Took them to overtime, and that was also Steve Newton.
That was also Steve Newton, and quite honestly, just an incredible run. And on a personal level, I've met Steve Newton and his wife. They are absolutely wonderful people. He follows the racers. He still keeps up with them. He wishes them success. I actually met him at a game Murray State was playing at Evansville a couple years ago, and he talked to me. He didn't know me. I'm just some Murray State fan. And he talked basketball, and we pointed out guys who were playing well and doing great things, and he's just a gentleman of the game, on a personal level, a fantastic guy, and he is definitely on my list of coaches when you talk about the greatest that have ever been.
Next in my trio, Billy Kennedy.
Yeah.
And Billy came in, and that first year, it's a miracle they had a winning season.
Absolutely.
Because he came in and he didn't inherit hardly anything from his predecessor.
Right.
So the cupboard was empty. They had no visits left.
That's the worst part. Having no roster and having no scholarship players, that hurts. That's devastating. Having no official visits to give cuts your legs out from under you.
Right. And somehow he manages to recruit enough guys that he has a 16-14 season.
Yep.
And pivotal in that was being able to get the 2 transfers from Birmingham Southern.
Absolutely.
Dwayne Paul and Kevin Thomas. No, not Kevin Thomas. Horton.
Yes.
Ed Horton. Dwayne Paul and Ed Horton. He got those guys. He got Denaro Thomas, who looked like a 35-year-old man with a pot belly when he came in.
Yeah, and now that's the best part about Jeff Bidwell's book, Extending the Stay to San Jose, is his discussion of what Denaro Thomas was. And he was a guy that had, he had trouble. That Katrina had hit, and it wiped out his academic record. So he goes to a prep school, and he's good. He's on a good prep school team. He's all but going to Miami because Billy Kennedy's recruiting him. Billy Kennedy gets a job at Murray State, and he comes to Murray State. And was trying to get home, was going to leave the program mid-year his freshman year, was going to leave, except he couldn't figure out how to get to the highway from where he was. He got lost. And they were able to talk him back into coming back onto campus. And you look at Billy Kennedy, and he understood what that was. That's a kid who's homesick. Some coaches might have been angry by that, or some of that. That's not Billy Kennedy's way. He was like, no, we want you here.
Of course, Denaro hit the shot against Vandy
Absolutely.
to win the NCAA tournament game for Billy in, 2009?
Yeah.
2009 or 2010?
Might have been 10. No,
I think it was 2010. 2010.
And honestly, what I call Billy, I kind of gave all the coaches on my list, I gave them kind of a nickname. So, Carlisle Cutchin is the Godfather, Harlan Hodges is the Builder, Cal Luther was the Right Stuff, Ron Green was the Rebirth, Steve Newton was the Next Step. I call Billy Kennedy the Chemist because he made a team out of guys that, there were a couple transfers, there were guys he inherited, and there were guys he recruited. And he brought the right people in, and not only did he come in and build a roster, which is difficult enough in college basketball, but he built a team where guys would sacrifice for each other in order to get the win. And you watch those guys, whenever you have 6 guys nearly scoring double digits, and you've got freshmen and seniors and transfers and guys you've recruited who've been there, since high school, and you get all these guys in there and you can make that work. That to me was the greatest thing that he could have done. I mean, you want to talk about building a legacy. The Billy Kennedy legacy was, we're going to bring in the right guys, not just the best guys we can find.
Right.
And that's a huge part of the success that Billy Kennedy had at Murray State and what he's done since Murray State.
Well, Billy talked about how, for him, coaching was a ministry, and it was about building young men.
Right.
And that was very important to him. The other thing that he talked about was, with regard to that 2010 team that beat Vandy in the NCAA tournament, balance. Balance is what he always wanted and aspired to for his team. And he will tell you that 2010 team was as balanced a team as he ever had.
Right.
And he could talk about balance in more ways than you or I could even think of. Because it's not just
shooters and passers and, inside and outside. It was more than that.
It was more than that.
Yeah.
Offense, defense, personalities. In all ways, that team was balanced and unselfish. And, they were extremely successful, got the victory over Vanderbilt, which was the second win in the NCAA tournament for Murray State. And then they nearly beat Butler.
Oh.
And that Butler team almost won the national championship.
Yeah, and you talk about Cinderellas and how that affects, trajectory, success in March and success going forward, and how that rolls into taking the next step. If you look where Butler was prior to that game, they were a good mid-major program. They were one of the best mid-major programs in the country. But they were in the Horizon League. They were coached by this young guy that nobody really knew. I mean, coaching circles knew him, but the national media didn't know who Brad Stevens was. They didn't know any of their players. Who's this Gordon Hayward kid? Who are these guys? What are they doing? At the time that game is played, Murray State and Butler were similar in a lot of ways.
That's true.
They were similar in a lot of ways. that game and the resulting success that Butler had, where Gordon Hayward's drafted in the first round of the NBA. Stevens is now the coach at Boston and is considered the bright young coach in the NBA, and deservedly so. Butler has moved now to the Big East. From the horizon to the Big East, that's a huge leap. And you look at that and you can kind of trace it all back to that pivotal point. And honestly, I've watched that game since it happened. I can't think of a better way that game ends, because you do exactly what you have to do. You put the ball in the hands of Isaiah Cannon, who's young, young. But knowing what I know now about Isaiah Cannon, he's the guy who has to have the ball in his hands at that point. He just has to.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all.
You might change some execution, but honestly...
The key thing about Billy Kennedy, though, that made him a great coach, ties in with what I was talking about him seeing it as a ministry. Billy was able to put together a team where it was bound together by love. Mm-hmm. Love for each other, love for him. Yep. They played for each other. They played for him. They didn't play for themselves.
Right.
And that was far more important in that team's success than X's and O's.
And I'll say this, and I think that this is absolutely true. You take those 6 guys off that team, and you could build relatively successful teams around that one person being the key cog. I mean, you could take even, Tony Easley by that point had developed into a skilled big man who did some things really well, was a good defensive player, could score, could rebound, could block shots. There are times you could put guys around him and have a good, successful team. Maybe not win an NCAA tournament game, but be really successful. Same thing with Miles. Miles was an extremely talented guard. I mean, you put the ball in his hands and he could do things. B.J. Jenkins was the most savvy basketball player I ever saw. He did stuff. I mean, he would just trick guys. Flat, smooth trick players. They did not know what he was going to do. And it belied the fact that he wasn't, a 55-inch vertical leaper. He wasn't a guy who was 6'6" with, a 7-foot wingspan.
He wasn't even extremely quick.
No, but what he did was he got every single ounce out of it, and he would do guys dirty. But you do that with all of those guys, and you look at what they did. He brings these guys together, and by each of them giving up a little bit of their own luster to being a star, they create something that is bigger than the sum of its parts. It's an incredible coaching job. It has to be just mentioned that way.
Now, the last guy in my trio is Steve Prohm.
Absolutely.
And Steve took over from Billy Kennedy, and Kennedy had won 2 consecutive OVC titles.
Yep.
Had in 2010 led the Racers to the victory over Vanderbilt.
Yep.
Nobody expected that the 2011-12 season, Prohm's first, was going to be a special year.
Well, maybe
the
nobody
Racers
outside
were picked,
of Murray.
The Racers were picked. The Racers were picked third.
True.
In the
Very
OVC
true.
at the beginning of that season, and I remember a buddy of mine telling Steve Prohm, "Well, all you got to do is go into the Memphis game undefeated, beat Memphis at Memphis, and then you'll be ranked in the top 25."
Right.
And it's set up for you.
It's simple.
And that was what they did, and it turned into the greatest season in Murray State history. 23 consecutive wins to start the season, and they go into the NCAA tournament, and they have a victory in the first round that wasn't a buzzer beater.
No.
They blew out Colorado State in the first round, beating them by 17 points. And, that was just phenomenal. And then in the second round, they're unable to beat Marquette, and it was just a game where
it was the absolute
they
worst
missed
matchup.
a lot of easy shots.
It was a bad matchup that came from poor seeding. But I will say this: what Steve Prohm did, and when you talk about Billy Kennedy and his concept of balance and his coaching philosophy, I think that team encompasses what Steve Prohm's was, which is I care enough about each of you guys individually that I'm going to find a way to get you the success that you're working so hard for.
Absolutely.
And it is a service leadership for Steve Prohm. That was always his thing. I'm not here to be your boss. I'm here to help you get those things that you want. And I'm going to bust my butt to make it happen. I care about you. I want you to have success. I want you to have good things. And I'm going to do everything in my power to put you in a position where you can grasp the things that you really want. And that's the ultimate you can ask of a coach.
And that was more important than X's and O's in Murray State's success. It was the fact that he loved the players knew he loved them and knew he would do anything in the world for them, and that was the secret to Murray State's success. However, I do want to mention one tactic that he employed that I think also helped greatly. They didn't switch on screens.
Yeah.
It was your job, if you were screened, fight your way through the screen.
Yep.
Not switching avoided confusion.
Yep.
And, a lot of coaches will switch all the time. Some coaches will switch sometimes.
Right.
And you can defend any approach from a strategic point of view. But when you're only considering what's easiest for the players and creates the least confusion,
right,
we don't switch.
Well, and that gives the biggest thing that I saw from the impact on the players that Steve Prohm had was the ability to instill and defend confidence. The one of the anecdotes that you hear about that season is after the previous season ended and they're in there talking to players getting ready for the next season, and they're doing the interviews and they're going through and they're asking them, hey, you've seen the schedule, this is what we're going to do. Who beats us? And I remember somebody saying that Jawan Long said, nobody. There's not a team on our schedule that can beat us. There's just not. We're going to beat every team on this schedule. And for the longest time, he was right. And Jawan Long is not a big, rah-rah mouthy guy. He was just stating a fact. It wasn't something that he was like, well, if I say this is gonna. No, it was, I really don't see anybody who should beat us on this list. And I think that's one of the things that the coaching style that Steve Prohm employed, that was part of it. You went in knowing, hey, this is the game plan. This is how we're going to attack it. We're going to practice this way. And come game day, no matter who's on the floor, it's going to be the right guy.
That leaves 4 coaches that we need to talk about.
Okay.
Scott Edgar.
Yep.
Mark Godfrey,
Yep.
Tavester Anderson,
Yep.
and Mick Cronin.
Yep.
Who's your pick among those?
Probably Mark Godfrey.
Okay.
The problem with Mark Godfrey was he wasn't here very long. He was extremely successful in a short time. I mean, and all those guys brought with them so much to university, and you can't fault any of those guys. But that's the only Mark. I mean, if Mark Godfrey's here for 2 more years and wins 2 more championships, he's on the list, no questions asked. Because that's the only way you can exclude him off the list is by saying, well, he wasn't here very long. Because he brought Murray State to the top 25 in the AP. He got them, at that time, the best seed that Murray State had ever gotten. He won games against big schools. He did all the things that you look for. He recruited quality guys that came in and played and did things that were amazing. Guys like Chad Townsend and D.T. Mays. I mean, there's just so many guys that you look at and say, oh my God, those guys are amazing. They're legends. And that's what Mark Godfrey did. So it's one of those, I go with him, but it's a razor's edge. I mean, you're talking about some really good coaches in there.
The guy I'm picking,
okay,
is his successor, Tavester Anderson. Now, if you
unheralded in a lot of ways.
If you look at Tavester, he averaged like 21 victories a season over
Right.
5 years.
Yeah.
And he got the Racers to 2 NCAA tournaments.
Yep.
Had a 24-point lead on Georgia
Yeah.
in the first round of the NCAA tournament in Chicago. Now, Tevester was not the best X's and O's coach in the world. He had assistants that he deferred to. He had
Absolutely.
a guy who he tabbed as his offensive coordinator, a guy who he tabbed as his defensive
But
coordinator.
give him credit for being aware enough of that fact to pick guys accordingly.
Absolutely.
That in and of itself is a brilliant thing to know.
And it shows
Here are my
humility.
That's it. I am limited on this. I can do this really well, and I can do this really well. I'm limited here. I'm going to surround myself with guys who I'm not going to feel challenged are better at the things that I'm not as good at. That to me is the sign of a great leader.
What he excelled at was recruiting.
Oh.
He was as good a recruiter as Murray State has ever had.
Amazing.
Brought in incredible
Amazing.
talent.
Amazing
Guys
recruiter.
like Aubrey Reese, Isaac Spencer, Rod Murray,
Yeah.
and, you know,
And you just
Justin
mentioned
Burdine.
you're mentioning guys who are, they're guys that whenever fans get together and talk about great teams or their favorite players or guys who did things that were amazing in blue and gold, those are guys who are always mentioned. I mean, you mentioned Ike Spencer, and everybody's got an Ike Spencer story.
And
everybody has an Aubrey Reese story. I mean, that's just how that works.
You mentioned that Coach Godfrey beat big name teams. So did Coach Anderson.
Absolutely.
And he got them to come and play at Murray State, and he kicked their butts. I remember Murray State was playing in a tournament in Louisville, and this was when Louisville was still playing in Freedom Hall. Anyway, Murray State played and beat Virginia Tech.
Yep.
And after the game, we're interviewing Coach Anderson in the hallway, and a reporter from the Courier-Journal says, "What's it feel like to beat a team from the Big East?" And Coach T says, "I'm undefeated against the Big East."
You know what? You love that though out of your coach. We just spoke a second ago about humility, but humility doesn't mean a lack of confidence. In fact, it's often the opposite. When you're humble and you know what your limitations are, you can be confident to say, "Hey, no, we're good enough to do this." You challenge the preconceived notions of what everyone thinks. You think, "Oh, it's Murray State. They're good. They're going to win the OVC," but they're not. They're probably not a national player. Coach Anderson, he didn't believe that. He said, "No, we're good enough. We're going to win in the OVC. We're going to win outside of the OVC, and it doesn't matter who we play. We got a shot to win that game."
I'm going to let you take Scott Edgar, and I'll talk about Mick Cronin.
So whenever I think about Scott Edgar, I think 40 Minutes of Hell. And I remember how many incredible athletes he brought in and transformed a team that was traditional in a lot of ways. I mean, traditional. And all of a sudden he brings in the 40 Minutes of Hell, and it's eye-opening, the guys he brings in. They shoot the three, they run the floor, they're pressing all the time. They're athletically gifted, they're running guys off the court, and they're scoring huge amounts of points. And he did it in a way that he's an intense guy, but it always just seemed to work. Not everybody can go in and take a group of guys and say, "This is what we're going to do. You're going to run more than you've ever run in your life. You're going to run until running and throwing up is what we do at practice. And we're going to do that every night, and we're going to do it against every team, and we're going to have success." That's hard to sell to high school basketball stars. A lot of guys don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear, "No, man, that's too much work. I want to go where I can be, I can ISO a guy and then take the jumper, or I can, do whatever. I can get on the block and put a move on a guy and go to the hole." I think that's the greatest thing that Edgar did, was he brought in guys who were superior athletes who would outwork a lot of other teams, that just plain outwork them. They were guys with chips on their shoulders. They came from, a lot of guys came from Memphis, the Memphis area. They wanted to come in and prove, "Hey, no, you guys missed on me, and I'm going to show you why you missed on me. I'm going to show you every night." And that's an incredible thing, because he was a motivator, and he took guys who were already motivated and he took them to that next level. And that's an incredible thing for a coach to do.
Mick Cronin, who was the Murray State coach 2004, 2005, 2006. He came in having been an assistant under Rick Pitino at the University of Louisville, and
Yep.
before that, an assistant under Bob Huggins
Yep.
at the University of Cincinnati. And really, Cronin's genius was his X's and O's ability.
Absolutely.
He may be the best tactician that Murray State has ever had. He comes in that first year and he wants to press full court the entire game and run up and down the floor the entire game.
Yep.
But, and at the beginning of the year, he told me, he said, look, he said, you have to install your system from the very beginning and make your players buy into it. And you use that system every game, no matter what the other team is doing.
Right.
You can't question your system. You don't adjust for your opponent. You play your way all the time, no matter what the score is. And long about midseason, he realized that while this is a good system, that might not be such a good idea.
Right.
And he began to learn to adjust.
Right.
So, that shows some humility, as we talked
and that's
about
the
earlier.
hardest thing for young coaches to do is
And
make adjustments.
His first year, at the beginning of the year, he was talking about how they were going to run up and down the floor. The slogan was "Catch me if you can," or actually "Catch us if you can." Okay. By the end of the season, they had taken fewer shots per game than Coach Anderson's team had
Yep.
the year before. And as time went on, by the time we got to 2006, which was probably his best team,
Yep.
at the end of the season anyway, they were playing at a much slower pace than they did in the
Right.
very beginning. And that shows how he grew as a head coach and was willing to change things. But there was nobody better in the huddle drawing up plays. Now,
Absolutely.
I do want to mention this, though. He had a little bit of a temper.
I'm sorry. I'm laughing hard at that because anybody who watched Mick Cronin at Murray State, if you said he had a little bit of the man's intense now, but he has mellowed dramatically from his time at Murray State. Now he's far more Zen-like than he ever was at Murray State. Oh, my goodness.
His first year, one of his assistants during a timeout tried to hand him a clipboard. I mean, you wouldn't think that would be a horrendous sin.
Right.
Tried to hand him a clipboard. And Cronin, who was worked up and screaming at the players, takes his hand and slaps the clipboard out of the assistant's hands, and it goes skittering across the floor.
Oh,
And he was so angry about that.
Has there ever been a bigger change in coach's demeanor in Murray State history than the one that happened when Mick Cronin left and Billy Kennedy came to the university? I mean, you talk about two completely different coaches.
How about Scott Edgar to Mark Gottfried?
Oh, that's pretty good too.
I mean,
yeah,
because as intense and angry as Cronin could be, Edgar kind of took that. There's a movie, David Lynch movie, Wild at Heart.
oh God. Okay.
To take a quote from that, Edgar was wild at heart and crazy on top.
Yeah, he was an intense fire breather. Both of those guys. You want to talk about guys who demanded 100% performance every second.
There's
you're
the famous
on
story
floor.
about Edgar making a couple of his players guard the horses in Racer Arena. There were these big wooden circles with horses painted on them up at the top. He wasn't happy with the way they were playing defense, and so for the rest of the practice, he had them stand in a defensive stance and guard the horses up at the top.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff just wouldn't fly nowadays, I don't think. And it's not a knock against. I mean, you talk about two guys who've had success elsewhere. They're still coaching. They're doing great things in basketball. They're changing people's lives. But you watch what those guys, and they're so just a caricature of their intensity. I mean, you want to talk about, when you talk about like Raleigh Massimino or somebody like that, these guys were more intense than Raleigh Massimino or John Chaney or some of these guys were. You wondered if they were going to have an aneurysm on the sideline, and it was a real worry. And what's funny about it is that you watch those guys develop. They're great guys. I mean, you can go and talk to them, and they'll talk.
Well, and Cronin, he had this demeanor that was off-putting to some people. But personally, one-on-one, I can remember now.
He's funny, man.
I can remember him and I sitting there talking, and we'd be talking about something, and he would say, "You and I, we know these things, but the fans." It's kind of that big city attitude,
right,
that
yeah.
I have displayed with my wife at times.
I'm sure that went over really well.
I told my friend Becky about this. I said, I used to tease Maryland, because I grew up in a big city and went to a big city school, and I'd grown up in a subdivision south of Louisville, and so Becky turned and she looked at me and she said, You come from Maryville.
It's funny when somebody knows you can call you out on stuff like that. But you look at a guy like Mick Cronin. This is a guy.
Maybe the most successful Murray State coach in his post-racer career.
Absolutely. And honestly, he's a guy that I don't think there's ever been a coach who, I mean, nowadays you look at what Mick Cronin is doing and how he's had success at Cincinnati and how he's evolved as a coach, because he's still intense. He still demands a lot from his players. He still demands success. But he's gotten philosophical. This is not something I would have expected from him. I mean, all you've got to do is find his postseason discussion last year, where he's talking about scheduling and he's talking about these things. These are real concerns in the NCAA that no coach ever talks about, because frankly, they just don't want to kick that hornet's nest. But Mick Cronin's got the guts to say, hey, this is what's going on. I don't know what to tell you. This is how it is. We're just working inside the system. This is what the system does. And honestly, I think the evolution of Mick Cronin has been the most impressive thing about Mick Cronin, is how he's evolved from this young fire eater of a coach to this seasoned, intelligent, highly evolved basketball mind. He's had a lot of success, and I think he'll continue to have success. Just a fantastic coach, and I'm glad he was here.
Anything else?
Yeah, quick rundown on a couple little things outside of this topic. Murray State Baseball had 3 guys drafted in the Major League Baseball draft. Derek Watson in the 25th round. A couple of signees. Jack Schneider out of Davies County was taken in the 11th round. Will Moriarty in the 32nd round out of South Oldham. We'll see if those guys make it to campus, those 2 guys, that they make it to campus, or if they decide that they want to go play pro. I think Schneider has a really big choice. Moriarty, he could probably come to Murray State and be very successful. 3 guys named to All-American teams. Brandon Gutzler, second-team All-American. Davis Sims and Ryan Perkins, both freshman All-Americans. And 3 guys over to the Independent League. John Lawler and those guys, they're going to do very, very good. NCAA hands-down suspensions to the University of Louisville, including a 5-gamer for Rick Pitino for lack of institutional control. They'll vacate records. No idea so far if they're going to take away their national championship. A 10-year show cause for the assistant who was in charge of all of that.
It was failure to monitor.
Failure to monitor. That's right.
To be clear.
It wasn't lack of institutional control. It was failure to monitor. It does bring up a question of, does the national championship stand? And looking back on it, was the year of the Cardinal really the year of the Cardinal? That's the question everybody's going to have to ask. I don't know. I don't know. They had a lot of success.
For Louisville fans, it will always be the year of the Cardinal, and whether they vacate the national championship or not, Louisville fans will always claim it.
Well, and everybody else will look at it and say the year of the parentheses vacated.
Right, absolutely. But, it's no different from the University of Kentucky.
Absolutely not.
And the various
it should
other
be the University of
institutions.
North Carolina, but we were both talking about it off air. There's probably nothing going to happen to the University of North Carolina.
They're too clever.
They're just too darn clever.
That brings to a close this edition of the Improbability Engine.